Introduction. Of all the historical studies written, few carry the weight and urgency of the story of Palestine. This work, based on the deep research of historian Muhammad Elhami, is not merely a record of the past. It is a response to the pressing crisis of our time. The history of this sacred land is a vast sea of conflicting narratives, hidden memoirs, and shocking betrayals. Yet, the mission of this faith demands that we seek the truth. As the historian delved deeper into the archives, the scale of tragedy and betrayal became clearer and more devastating than ever imagined. In this path of seeking the truth, we find our strength in the words of Allah Almighty. And say, truth has come, and falsehood has departed. Indeed is falsehood, by nature, ever bound to depart. This is the essence of our study, to distinguish the enduring truth of Palestine from the vanishing shadows of falsehood. Join us as we uncover the roots, the lessons, and the unyielding spirit of a nation that refuses to be forgotten. To understand the tragedy of Palestine, we must look beyond the surface. The Jewish claim to Jerusalem is rooted in the era of the prophetic kings, David and Solomon. But after their kingdom crumbled under the Babylonians and Romans, the land's identity evolved for thousands of years. For over 3 millennia, Jewish dreams of return remained mere legends, until the political tides of the 19th century began to shift. It was during the rule of Muhammad Ali Pasha that the first real cracks in the Islamic defense of Palestine appeared. His occupation of Syria and Palestine was not just a military move. It was a brutal colonial experiment that mirrored British and French tactics. Muhammad Ali prioritized foreign interests over the lives of his own subjects. He integrated Jewish networks into his administration and systematically removed taxes for foreign pilgrims while burdening Muslims with taxes 7 times higher. Under his watch, the demographic fabric of Jerusalem began to tear. He allowed the construction of 9 synagogues and numerous monasteries without the traditional oversight that had preserved the city's Islamic character for centuries. This was a time of profound humiliation. While foreign merchants and consuls gained unprecedented immunity, respected Muslim leaders were forced into subservience, often seeking refuge in the very consulates that were orchestrating their displacement. As the historian Muhammad Elhami points out, this was the beginning of an era where truth was hidden and betrayal was masked as progress. Chapter 1: The Ottoman Fortress Against Zionism. The departure of Muhammad Ali Pasha from Syria did not restore the old peace. He left behind a region transformed by foreign influence, growing Jewish communities, and a British consulate that served as a spearhead for Western intervention. The Ottoman Empire, though reclaiming its lands, found itself weakened and increasingly dependent on British support, a vulnerability that foreign powers were quick to exploit. Historian Muhammad Elhami reveals that between the fall of Muhammad Ali and the rise of Theodor Herzl, a wave of Jewish initiatives swept the region. Figures like Lawrence Oliphant proposed massive settlement plans in the land of Gilead, while Samuel Montague and German Zionists like Bollendorf pressured Sultan Abdul Hamid II to permit Jewish colonies in eastern Jordan, even suggesting the expulsion of local Bedouins. These efforts were backed by a network of European and Russian organizations providing financial and industrial aid to bolster the Jewish presence. This movement was fueled by high-ranking European politicians who aligned imperialist goals with Zionist ambitions. Leaders like Ernest Laron, Napoleon III's secretary, and British prime ministers like Lord Palmerston and Lloyd George were driven by a Protestant education that prioritized biblical lands over British history. They saw the Jews as a strategic tool for their own empires. Foreign consuls in the Levant exploited Ottoman financial crises and legal loopholes, such as land ownership laws and auctioning of state lands due to national debt, to secure territories for Jewish settlers. They even protected Jewish individuals under foreign privileges, often blatantly violating Ottoman laws through corrupt or westernized officials. Yet, Ottoman resistance was fierce and predated the modern Zionist movement by centuries. Long before Herzl, Ottoman sultans had issued decrees banning Jewish settlement in Sinai. When Ottoman rule returned to Syria, they immediately dismantled Moses Monnefiore's large-scale settlement projects. In 1846, Sultan Abdul Mejid issued a direct decree to the governor of Jerusalem to repossess lands bought by foreign Jews and resell them to Ottoman subjects, enforcing laws that prohibited foreign Jewish land ownership. The resistance intensified under Sultan Abdulaziz, who in 1870 designated 80% of Palestinian lands as crown lands to block any potential sales. By 1874, Jerusalem was elevated to a mutasarrifate linked directly to Istanbul, ensuring it was under the Sultan's direct watch. Sultan Abdul Hamid II later faced immense American and European pressure to admit Jewish refugees fleeing Russian pogroms. His response was categorical. They could settle in any Ottoman province as subjects, but Palestine was strictly off-limits. By 1882, the Sultan banned Jewish immigrants from even disembarking at Palestinian ports, ordering the deportation of those who entered illegally. In the 1890s, he went further, closing every legal loophole and using his private treasury to purchase Palestinian lands, placing them under his personal protection. He warned that these settlers aimed to establish a Mosaic government, a conspiracy that would eventually dismantle Islamic authority. The Ottomans did not view Palestine as a mere territory, but as Sham Sharif, the noble Levant, a sacred trust they defended until their final breath. Chapter 15: The Birth of Zionism, a European Solution. The roots of Zionism were not planted in Palestine, but in the blood-stained history of Europe. For centuries, a deep-seated hostility existed between Christians and Jews, fueled by the belief that Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. This religious tension led to a recurring pattern of persecution and massacres, especially when Jews allied with Persian invaders against the Roman Empire in the Levant. In medieval Europe, this hatred evolved into a systemic ghetto culture. Jews lived in isolated quarters, monopolizing trades like gold and usury, which further alienated them from society and made them easy scapegoats for rulers during times of unrest. While Western Europe eventually moved towards secularism and nationalism, allowing some Jews to rise as powerful bankers and ministers, Eastern Europe and Russia remained a nightmare of marginalization and fear. Everything exploded in 1881 after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Blamed for the act, Jews in Russia faced waves of terror and pogroms, sparking a massive migration westward. This is where the Zionist project found its human capital. While wealthy Jews in the West were reluctant to leave their luxury, the desperate refugees from the East provided the necessary population for a settler state. Western politicians saw an opportunity to solve two problems at once: getting rid of the Jewish question in Europe and planting a permanent military base in the heart of the Islamic East. The establishment of a Jewish homeland was the price paid by the Muslim world through its blood and land as a European compensation for crimes it did not commit. Zionism was transformed from a religious aspiration into a colonial thorn embedded in the body of the East, serving as an advanced base for European empires. In this tragic irony, the weak continued to pay the price for the wars and sins of the powerful. Chapter 3: Herzl, the architect of modern Zionism. The transition from religious longing to a political reality required a master manipulator, and that man was Theodor Herzl. A brilliant Austrian journalist, Herzl realized that the Jews could never establish a state through simple migration. They needed the crushing power of European colonialism. Herzl's project was built on three pillars: the precedent set by Muhammad Ali's earlier policies, the rising tide of European nationalism, and, most importantly, aligning Jewish interests with Western colonial ambitions. He famously argued that the Jews were a people without a land, for a land without a people, a slogan that ignored the existing population of Palestine to create a moral justification for his movement. Herzl was a political chameleon. He traveled to every major capital, tailoring his message to fit each empire's greed and fears. To the Germans, He promised that a Jewish state would act as a buffer zone against French and Russian expansion, while also solving their Jewish refugee problem at home. To the British, he offered a strategic alternative to the Suez Canal, a Jewish-financed railway linking the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, ensuring British dominance over trade routes at no cost to London. He even played on Protestant Second Coming prophecies to win over religious officials. To the Russians, he suggested that relocating Jews would end internal revolutionary threats, promising that Jerusalem would remain free from commerce to ease their religious concerns. But Herzl faced a hidden enemy, the Jews themselves. Many Western Jews saw Zionism as a dangerous conspiracy to expel them from their comfortable lives. Rabbis viewed his secular movement with suspicion. To overcome this, Herzl adopted a dark and chilling philosophy. He famously stated that anti-Semites will be our most reliable friends. He believed that persecution was necessary to force Jews to emigrate. The Zionist movement would eventually collaborate with any power, even the most hostile, if it served the goal of expulsion toward Palestine. Herzl firmly rejected gradual infiltration. He didn't want Jews to appear as rebels against the Sultan. Instead, he wanted the Jewish state to be a grand decision made in European capitals. He sought to force the Sultan's hand through a mix of massive financial bribes and intense diplomatic pressure from the great powers. His success wasn't due to Jewish strength, but to his ability to hitch the Zionist wagon to the unstoppable engine of 19th century colonialism. The price of this state would be paid not just by Palestinians, but by the lives of many Jews sacrificed in European turmoil to fuel the necessity of migration. The Sultan and the journalist, the Great Maneuver. The confrontation between Theodor Herzl and Sultan Abdulhamid II was a clash between a desperate colonial ambition and a principled imperial resistance. Herzl sought to buy Palestine, presenting a proposal he thought the Sultan couldn't refuse. He offered to pay off the Ottoman Empire's massive debts and promised to use his media influence to polish the Sultan's image in the hostile Western press. He even offered to mediate and calm the Armenian uprisings that were tearing at the empire's borders. But the Sultan's response was a thunderclap that still echoes in history. "I cannot sell even a foot of this land, for it does not belong to me, but to my people. Let the Jews keep their billions. If the empire is divided, they may receive Palestine for nothing, but it will only be divided over our dead bodies." Despite this firm rejection, Abdulhamid was a master of realpolitik. He didn't cut ties immediately. Instead, he used Herzl. He led him on with counterproposals, like purchasing Cyprus for the Sultan, while tasking Herzl with defending Ottoman interests in Europe and supporting the empire during its war with Greece. Herzl even founded a newspaper to back the Ottomans, hoping these services would eventually win him the land. In the end, the Sultan gained a powerful lobbyist for free, while Herzl gained nothing but a Medal of Honor. Behind the scenes, the Sultan's resistance was systematic and relentless. He established special committees in Jerusalem to enforce strict entry laws. Foreign Jews were forced to pay security deposits and carry red passports, temporary residence permits valid for only 3 months. He purged corrupt officials, like the governor of Jerusalem, who were lenient with migrants, and replaced them with his own loyal secretaries to maintain direct oversight from Istanbul. Yet, the Sultan was fighting a dying empire's ailments. Administrative corruption and intense pressure from foreign consuls allowed some migration to leak through. While critics point to the growth of the Jewish population during his reign, the numbers tell a different story. Only about 25% of the massive wave of Russian Jewish refugees managed to settle in Palestine. The Sultan had successfully held the line against a global tide. By the end of his life, a frustrated Herzl even considered a plot to bomb the Sultan's palace. He knew that as long as Abdulhamid held the throne, the Zionist dream was dead. When the Sultan was finally deposed in 1909, he believed it was the price for his stand on Palestine. With his fall, the doors were kicked open. His successors, driven by opportunism rather than principle, lacked the strategic vision to protect the noble sham, and the tragedy of the occupation began in earnest. Chapter 4. Zionism after Herzl, the shift in strategy. Theodor Herzl died in 1904 at the young age of 44, but he left behind a prophecy that would haunt history. In his diaries, he predicted that while the world might laugh at the Basel Congress, a Jewish state would emerge in 50 years. He was right. Herzl believed that a state is built on two things: the collective will of a people and the iron will of a single individual. However, after his death, the Zionist movement fell into nearly 16 years of confusion and stagnation. Leaders like David Wolfson and Otto Warburg lacked Herzl's brilliance and dynamic energy. This period of turmoil is the ultimate proof that Zionism, on its own, was too weak to achieve its monumental goal. It was a movement that stalled the moment its founder disappeared, proving that its eventual success was not due to its own power, but to the life support provided by European imperialism. Everything changed with the arrival of Chaim Weizmann in 1920. Weizmann was as resilient as Herzl, but far more fortunate. The winds of history were now blowing in favor of Zionism. The great obstacle, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, had been deposed in 1909, and the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. By the end of World War I, the British Empire occupied Palestine, providing the movement with its greatest patron and protector. With the Sultan gone, the Zionist strategy underwent a radical shift. Herzl had once strictly rejected gradual infiltration, fearing that illegal immigration would provoke the Sultan and lead to mass expulsions. But at the 8th Zionist Congress in 1907, the movement reversed this policy. They began organizing a slow, steady, and managed infiltration of Jews into Palestine. Their goal was to create a fait accompli, a physical presence on the ground that could exert political pressure on the weakening Ottoman administration and eventually demand international protection. Weizmann realized that colonialism cannot breathe life into a dead body, but it can empower a determined one. Zionism was no longer just a dream. It had become a calculated colonial partnership, waiting for the final collapse of the Islamic Caliphate to claim its prize. The seeds Herzl sowed were now being watered by British bayonets, setting the stage for the first president of a state built on the ruins of others. Chapter 5. Conditions in Palestine and the Absence of Resistance. Historians often ask, was Palestine truly a land without a people? The evidence says no. But if it was teeming with life and culture, how did it become so vulnerable to occupation? To answer this, we must look into the anatomy of weakness that plagued the late Ottoman era. The theory of Ibn al-Athir. The great historian Ibn al-Athir once explained the Mongol sweep of Islamic lands through a chilling theory: the absence of resistance. He argued that when a ruler centralizes every ounce of power, destroying all local leadership to become the sole authority, the entire system becomes fragile. If that leader falls, the whole nation collapses. This was the tragedy of the Ottoman modernization. In their attempt to copy the Western bureaucratic model, the Ottomans unwittingly eroded the social fabric of Palestine. Society lost its self-reliance. It became a body that could no longer move without orders from a distant, struggling capital. The rift of nationalism, the shared identity that once united the Arab and the Turk, was torn apart. Under the Committee of Union and Progress, a harsh secular regime began a campaign of Turkification, led by the iron fist of Jamal Pasha. Simultaneously, the British were whispering in the ears of Sharif Hussein, promising an Arab caliphate, a mirage designed to serve British interests. This created a fatal cycle of suspicion. The unity that had been a reality for centuries dissolved into a bitter conflict between brothers, exactly when the enemy was at the gates. The elite and the British entrance. When British boots finally hit the soil of Palestine, they found a fragmented society. The remaining elites, whose sons had studied in London and Paris, were caught between the nostalgia for the days of prosperity under the Ottomans and the alluring promises of Western progress. Exhausted by war, famine, and displacement, the people had no means to oppose a global superpower that had just emerged victorious from a world war. The betrayal of sanctuary. There's a painful irony in this story. For centuries, Islamic civilization was the only sanctuary for minorities. While Europe was drowning in inquisitions and pogroms, the Ottoman sultans welcomed Jews and Protestants with open arms. Jewish historians like Michael Winter and Salo Baron admit that Jews reached heights of prosperity and freedom in Islamic lands that they never knew elsewhere. The Ottomans were their protectors when the rest of the world was their executioner. The turning point, 1909, but gratitude was replaced by political opportunism. The year 1909 changed everything. After the deposition of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the gates were kicked open. The new regime, desperate for gold, began selling state lands and lifting immigration bans. In that same year, the first armed Jewish guards were formed, the very seed of the Zionist army. By 1911, they were demanding Hebrew as an official language. Those who arrived as impoverished refugees, seeking mercy, now stood as a colonial force, backed by the very powers seeking to dismantle the empire. Conclusion: Zionist settlers were offered Ottoman citizenship. They were offered a home as neighbors. But they chose to be a Western-oriented thorn instead. They turned against the civilization that honored them, proving that strength is the only true safeguard for morals. As the Quran warned centuries ago, "O you who have believed, do not take as intimates those other than yourselves, for they will not spare you any ruin." Hatred has already appeared from their mouths, and what their breasts conceal is greater. Chapter 6. The period of British occupation and the triple betrayal. For decades, the Ottoman Empire survived not by its own strength, but through the delicate balance of international rivalries. Britain, France, and Russia were like vultures circling a dying lion, each waiting for the other to blink. Sultan Abdul Hamid II navigated these treacherous waters, hoping a major conflict would allow for an Ottoman revival. But the great powers were patient. They settled their disputes at his expense, and the war he feared only erupted 5 years after his fall. World War I and the German alliance. World War I with a European fire that eventually consumed the Islamic East. With the Allied powers refusing to guarantee the safety of Ottoman lands, the empire was forced into a desperate alliance with Germany. When the dust of the Great War settled, the Axis powers lay defeated, and the Ottoman Empire was dismantled. It was here in the Levant that the most calculated deception in modern history was executed. The Triple Promise. During the war, Britain engaged in a masterclass of political manipulation, issuing 3 contradictory promises to 3 different parties. First, the betrayal of the Arabs. To Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the British promised a vast Arab caliphate from Iraq to the Hijaz. In return, Hussein and his sons, Faisal and Abdullah, launched the Arab Revolt, striking the Ottomans at their weakest moment. This betrayal was so profound that even during the war, the people of Palestine still viewed the Ottoman Sultan as their legitimate leader, seeing Hussein as a rebel against the faith. In a final act of humiliation, the British gave Faisal's approval to the Balfour Declaration, forcing him to trade Palestine for a throne his father would never keep. Hussein ended his life in exile, unable to even pay his rent, while his sons were placed on thrones in Iraq and Jordan, regimes created solely to serve British interests. The Balfour Declaration, second, the promise to the Zionists. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Balfour issued his infamous declaration. He treated Palestine as a land without a people, referring to its ancient inhabitants merely as non-Jewish communities. This was the crowning achievement of Zionism. It transformed a dream from a Jewish organization into the official policy of the world's greatest superpower. With the support of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, the Balfour Declaration silenced Jewish critics of Zionism and triggered a massive wave of immigration, now protected by British bayonets. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, third, the secret partition. While promising independence to the Arabs, Britain and France were secretly carving up the map. Through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they drew the borders of the modern Middle East. France seized Syria and Lebanon, while Britain took Iraq and Palestine. The unity of the Levant, which had existed for 1,000 years, was dissolved. Palestine was no longer a province of a Muslim empire. It was now a direct British colony, prepared as a gift for the Zionist movement. Conclusion: somber and reflective. None of this could have happened without Britain's military victory. When the British army entered Jerusalem, the era of Ottoman protection ended, and the era of the thorn began. Sharif Hussein's story remains a haunting lesson. He placed his absolute faith in those who saw him only as a temporary tool. In the end, only one promise was fulfilled: the Balfour Declaration, while the Arab dreams of unity were buried under the sands of betrayal. The fall of Jerusalem was not a sudden stroke of luck. It was the result of a massive military machine fueled by decades of colonial preparation. Since 1882, Britain had held Egypt as its primary base, turning its lands and people into the engine for its expansion. More than 500,000 Egyptians were mobilized, their resources and labor redirected to serve the British crown in a campaign that would eventually tear Palestine away from the Islamic world. The Suez Canal, the strategic breach. The Suez Canal was the linchpin. Built under the Muhammad Ali dynasty, it had become a dangerous breach in regional security, a highway for British troops and wealth stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. To the Ottomans, reclaiming the canal was the only way to sever the British colonial artery. To the British, defending it was a matter of imperial survival. This clash of interests led to the Three Battles of Gaza, a brutal struggle where the Ottomans initially held their ground, defeating the British twice. The arrival of Allenby. The tide turned when Britain dispatched its most skilled commander, General Edmund Allenby. But Allenby's victory was not won by bullets alone. It was won by logistics. Egyptian laborers and engineers were forced to build an unprecedented infrastructure, laying pipes to transport fresh water and supplies across the scorching Sinai Desert. This lifeline allowed British forces to sustain themselves in the arid wilderness, ultimately breaking the Ottoman lines in the Third Battle of Gaza and opening the gates to the heart of Palestine. The end of the Crusades. On December 17, 1917, the unimaginable happened. General Allenby entered Jerusalem. As he walked through its ancient gates, the British press captured the spirit of the moment with a chilling headline: "The Crusades are now over." By 1918, British forces had swept across the rest of Palestine, ignoring their secret agreements with the French and establishing a total military occupation. The vision of the British Empire. Why did Britain champion the Zionist project so fiercely? It wasn't just about religious affinity or Protestant ideology. To London, a Jewish state was a strategic investment. In an era of fierce competition with Russia and France, Britain saw a Jewish homeland as a permanent, loyal outpost under British sovereignty. They did not envision a withdrawal. They saw a future where British officers held the real power, while local administrations provided a veneer of autonomy, much like their arrangements in Egypt and Iraq. Palestine was to be the ultimate fortress, safeguarding British interests in the East forever. The occupation of Jerusalem marked the end of an era of protection and the beginning of a colonial experiment that would change the Middle East forever. The thorn was now planted, not just by Zionist ambition, but by the overwhelming might of an empire that believed its reign would never end. Chapter 7. The British Preparation for Israel. The establishment of a Zionist state was not a sudden event of 1948. It was a decades-long construction project managed by the British Empire. When the British Army marched into Palestine, they did not come alone. Alongside them was the first Jewish military unit, and with them came Chaim Weizmann. No longer just an investor, Weizmann arrived as a political leader to lay the foundations of a state. By 1919, 30 years before the official declaration of Israel, he had already established a Zionist intelligence network to map the land, its people, and potential sources of resistance. The British strategy was one of deliberate, patient preparation. As early as 1915, Zionist ministers within the British government argued that a Jewish homeland could not be declared prematurely. They insisted on a period of British occupation to ripen the conditions. This architect of transition was Herbert Samuel, appointed as the High Commissioner in 1920. Under his rule, the Ottoman restrictions on immigration were abolished, and the Ottoman Agricultural Bank, which supported Arab farmers, was dissolved. In its place, Jewish banks were empowered, leading to a cycle of debt that forced Arab landowners to forfeit their property. Under British protection, a parallel state began to breathe. Jews were permitted to arm themselves and form independent military units. A separate educational system was established, and Hebrew was recognized as an official language. Vast tracts of state and communal lands were seized and transferred to Jewish ownership, all legitimized by the British Mandate Charter. This international document, approved by the League of Nations, turned the Balfour Declaration into a legal obligation for Britain to prepare the land for a Jewish state. By 1925, the Jewish Agency had evolved into a governing power within the Mandate, representing Jews internationally and building the institutions of a future nation. While Palestinians made up 92% of the population, Britain systematically hindered the growth of Palestinian institutions while fast-tracking Jewish ones. By the 1930s, the Jewish population doubled, and by 1935, Zionist factories were already exporting diamonds and cotton. The military evolution was equally rapid. During the 1929 uprising, Palestinians were stunned to face organized, structured Jewish ranks. By the late 1930s, 15,000 Jews enlisted with the Allied forces in World War II, gaining advanced military expertise and weapons proficiency that far surpassed the local population. The Haganah militia transformed into a formalized army with its own air fleet. Behind the scenes, intelligence officers compiled a village file, a comprehensive database on every Palestinian village, documenting its economy, population, and the logistics required to occupy it. As World War II erupted, a rift formed between the Zionists and Britain over the White Paper policy, which sought to limit immigration to pacify the Great Palestinian Revolt. David Ben-Gurion navigated this with cold pragmatism, vowing to fight the Nazis alongside Britain as if the White Paper did not exist, while fighting the White Paper as if the war had not begun. However, radical factions like the Irgun and the Stern Gang turned their guns on the British. They saw Britain as a fading power and an obstacle to total statehood. This culminated in the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel, signaling that Zionism had found a new, more powerful patron, the United States. By 1948, the transformation was complete. During 30 years of British rule, the Jewish population had increased 13-fold, from 50,000 to 650,000. While Palestinians owned nearly 98% of the land in 1918, by the time Britain handed the issue to the United Nations, Zionist forces had seized control of 60% of it. The State of Israel was not born on the day of its declaration. It had been meticulously assembled, piece by piece, under the umbrella of British colonial power, until it became an irreversible fact on the ground. The situation of Palestinian society under British occupation. The arrival of the British in Palestine was not just a military occupation. It was a profound trauma for a society already broken by the horrors of World War I. The land had endured famine, mass conscription into the Ottoman ranks, and the literal decimation of cities like Gaza under British bombardment. For the first time in 6 centuries, since the era of the Mamluks, the people of Palestine found themselves under the rule of a foreign, non-Islamic power. For 14 centuries, this land had been a limb of a vast Islamic body, yet suddenly the body was gone. When Mustafa Kemal Ataturk abolished the caliphate in Turkey, he severed the ties that had defined Palestinian identity for generations. The people were left in a state of bewilderment. They were no longer subjects of Sultan. They were now being told they were Palestinians. This was a novel idea. Previously, a man identified by his family, his city, or his faith. Now, Palestine was emerging as a distinct homeland, defined not by its inclusion in an empire, but by its resistance to an occupier. Nationalism began to permeate the social fabric through several key channels. Foreign missionary schools and Ottoman state institutions alike became breeding grounds for these new ideas. As education levels rose, so did a new class of intellectuals influenced by the nationalist narratives flowing from Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon. Furthermore, history shows that an oppressed people often begin to emulate their conquerors. As the Islamic Caliphate collapsed, its ideologies faced rejection, and many, even religious scholars and judges, began to gravitate toward the secular and nationalist ideas of the prevailing European powers. Regional support vanished. The neighboring leaders no longer saw the defense of Jerusalem as their collective duty. Palestinians found themselves turning to the global principles of self-determination, endorsed by the American president, to negotiate for an independence that the British had no intention of granting. British policy under Herbert Samuel was designed with a sharp contradiction at its heart. It nurtured a Jewish state that lacked the elements of statehood, while actively dismantling a Palestinian society that possessed them. Britain stifled any form of representative Arab leadership. While other Arab nations under British rule were granted client regimes and a veneer of autonomy, Palestine was uniquely denied even a local government. Instead, Britain exploited rivalries between influential families like the Husseinis and the Nashashibis to ensure the society remained fractured. The social harmony of Palestine was further disrupted by the rise of a new administrative class. Young, educated Palestinians found that the only path to social mobility was to work within the British colonial apparatus. Tasked with tax collection and bureaucratic management, these employees were not necessarily loyal to the occupier, but they became a functional part of its machine. This created a rift between the emerging secular elite and the traditional Islamic identity of the masses. To ensure total control, the British systematically stoked religious divisions. While Muslims, Christians, and Jews had a long history of coexistence, evidenced by shared commerce and even intermarriage in cities like Jaffa, the occupation began to tilt the scales. By granting exclusive privileges and high-ranking positions to certain minorities, the British reduced the collective resistance to their rule. Palestinian society was trapped in a vice. On one side was a foreign occupation introducing Western secularism. On the other was the existential threat of Zionism. Understanding this fractured reality provides a clear lens into the nature of the resistance that followed. A movement struggling to unite a people whose traditional world had been dismantled, leaving them to build a national identity while fighting for their very survival. Chapter 8. Resistance in Palestine. The struggle of the weak against the mighty. Following the collapse of the Ottoman era, Palestinian resistance emerged in two distinct forms: peaceful political legalism and armed struggle. The peaceful movement sought to use Britain's own laws and slogans against it. This was the strategy of society drained of its traditional power, attempting to shame a global superpower into adhering to its proclaimed values. However, this path was fraught with complexity. The British co-opted local elites, creating what researchers call tame nationalism, a class of leaders who competed to appease the occupiers in exchange for personal privileges, while simultaneously presenting themselves to the people as the only ones capable of securing concessions. Despite these internal fractures, the peaceful resistance organized 7 Arab Congresses between 1919 and 1928. Led by figures like Musa Kazim al-Husseini, they demanded the annulment of the Balfour Declaration and an end to land sales. To counter this influence, the British appointed his cousin, Amin al-Husseini, as the Mufti of Jerusalem. Though initially conciliatory, the Mufti soon transformed into the undisputed leader of the resistance, leveraging his religious authority to mobilize the masses through mosques and Quranic schools. Peaceful efforts suffered a devastating blow in 1931 with the infamous Black Letter from the British Prime Minister, which reaffirmed total support for Zionism. Recognizing that diplomacy was reaching a dead end, a more radical sentiment took hold. The people began to see the British as the tree and the Zionist presence as its shadow. The shadow would only vanish if the tree itself were cut down. This realization culminated in the rise of Sheikh al-Din al-Qassam. A man of deep religious conviction, al-Qassam built a secret, decentralized network of cells in northern Palestine. He bypassed the traditional elites, who were too fearful of British retaliation to support him. In 1935, Al-Qassam took to the hills to launch a direct revolt. Though he became one of its first martyrs in November of that year, his death ignited the largest uprising in Palestinian history, the Great Arab Revolt of 1936. The revolt began with the longest general strike in history, lasting 6 months and involving the entire nation. A unified Higher Arab Committee was formed, but Britain responded with unprecedented brutality. To crush the 3-year revolution, Britain deployed 100,000 soldiers, one for every 4 Palestinians. They used civilians as human shields, demolished homes for a single spent bullet, and conducted systematic assassinations of field leaders. By 1939, the cost was staggering. 5,000 Palestinians were martyred, and 14,000 were wounded. This represented 10% of the adult male population, the very generation that should have fought the Zionist militias a decade later. In many ways, the Nakba of 1948 was set in motion here by the exhaustion and disarmament of the Palestinian people at the end of the 30s. Even in defeat, the resistance forced a concession, the 1939 White Paper, which promised to limit Jewish immigration. But as World War II ended, Britain abandoned these promises under pressure from the rising superpower, the United States. The Mufti, Amin al-Husseini, fled through Lebanon, Iraq, and Germany, eventually reaching Egypt to lead the next desperate phase of the struggle. The story of Palestinian resistance is not one of simple failure, but of extraordinary valor against an impossible disparity in power. A small, resource-poor people had stood against the world's dominant empire and the rising tide of Zionism, proving their courage in a fight that few others would have dared to sustain. Chapter 9, The Nakba of 1948 and the Fractured Arab Front. In 1948, the world witnessed a demographic and territorial catastrophe. Palestinians entered the conflict as the clear majority, owning 94% of the land. By the end, they were a displaced people, with Israel seizing 78% of the territory and 800,000 Palestinians driven from their homes. To understand how this happened, we must look beyond the borders of Palestine to the surrounding Arab nations, states that were independent in name, but governed by regimes deeply entangled with their colonial masters. Egypt, the most powerful neighbor, had been under British shadow for 40 years. Despite the massive 1919 revolution, Britain had successfully diverted the uprising into a liberal era that kept real power in London's hands. During this time, the Egyptian political elite grew increasingly indifferent to the Palestinian cause. Egypt became a hub for Zionist propaganda, hosting pro-Zionist newspapers that openly advocated for a Jewish homeland. Prominent Egyptian intellectuals and politicians traveled to the opening of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, framing Zionism as a movement of progress. When the Great Strike of 1936 paralyzed Palestine, the Egyptian government even allowed workers to cross the border to break the strike. The prevailing sentiment among the elite was summed up by the Prime Minister. "I am the Prime Minister of Egypt, not the Prime Minister of Palestine." To the east lay the Emirate of Transjordan, a barren territory created by Britain for Abdullah, the son of Sharif Hussein. Abdullah was perhaps Britain's most loyal ally, commanding an army led and funded by British officers. Hemmed in by more powerful neighbors, Abdullah viewed Palestine not as a cause to save, but as a territory to annex. He was the only Arab leader to endorse the UN partition plan, secretly meeting with Zionist leaders like Golda Meir to ensure that when the British withdrew, he would claim the Arab-designated lands for his own crown. In Syria, the situation was defined by instability and rivalry. After being ousted by the French, the Hashemite family was replaced by a Republican regime that viewed Jordan's King Abdullah with deep suspicion. The Arab world was split into 2 camps: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Syria on one side, and the Hashemite kingdoms of Iraq and Jordan on the other. This internal rift was a gift to the Zionist project. Behind these frontline states, the rest of the Arab world was equally paralyzed. Iraq was under British dominance, and Saudi Arabia, before the era of oil wealth, was a sparsely populated kingdom whose borders were drawn by British hands. The tragic reality of 1948 was that the Palestinian people stood against a unified, technologically advanced Zionist movement, while their allies were a collection of weak, fragmented regimes. These governments were often more concerned with their own survival and their relationships with colonial powers than with the defense of Jerusalem. The Zionist state was not only built on the strength of its own militias, but stabilized by the complicity and incompetence of an Arab leadership that was independent in title, but subservient in spirit. The Nakba was not just a military defeat. It was the inevitable result of a regional system designed by colonial powers to ensure that no unified resistance could ever truly succeed. Chapter 10. The Partition of Palestine, a Legacy of Betrayal. As the dust of World War II settled, the global balance of power shifted. Britain, battered and depleted, began to retreat from its colonies, while the United States emerged as the new architect of global influence. The Zionist movement, with calculated pragmatism, shifted its allegiance from London to Washington. To the world, Zionist militias framed themselves as a liberation movement fighting to expel British occupiers, a narrative that won them sympathy in a world increasingly focused on self-determination. The reality on the ground, however, was far more cynical. While Zionist groups carried out hundreds of operations against British targets, they had already secured the protection of the United States. In Washington, the movement had successfully financed the campaign of President Harry Truman, who rewarded them by authorizing the immigration of 100,000 Jews to Palestine. Meanwhile, in Palestine, the British continued to disarm and arrest Palestinians, even as they turned a blind eye to the growing military industrialization of the Haganah. By 1947, the newly formed United Nations became the stage for the final betrayal. Through Resolution 181, the UN proposed to partition a land it neither owned nor understood. The resolution was a geopolitical anomaly. It allocated nearly 55% of the territory to a Jewish minority that owned less than 6% of the land, while the indigenous Palestinians, who owned 90% of the soil, were left with less than half of their own country. This plan was pushed through by powers with no connection to the region, from Haiti to the Philippines, without once consulting the people whose fate was being decided. The official Arab response was a storm of empty rhetoric. Behind the scenes, the Arab League remained under British influence, while King Abdullah of Jordan secretly welcomed the plan, hoping to annex the Arab-designated areas into his own kingdom. The Arab military forces were a collection of fragmented, ill-equipped units, barred by British policy from entering Palestine until the very day of the withdrawal. In contrast, the Zionist state was already a fait accompli. By early 1948, the Jewish Agency commanded a professional fighting force of over 45,000 men, equipped with aircraft and heavy weaponry. As the British announced their departure from May 1948, they delivered one final service to the Zionist cause. In a coordinated series of retreats, the British handed over key cities and government buildings directly to Zionist militias. Palestinians often woke to find that the British had vanished overnight, leaving the gates wide open for Zionist forces to occupy their homes. The partition plan did not bring peace. It was the catalyst for a war of conquest. The Palestinians, exhausted by decades of suppression and stripped of their weapons, were left to face a global superpower-backed army with nothing but their indomitable courage. The Nakba was not an accident of history. It was a meticulously orchestrated handover of a nation from an old empire to a new colony. Chapter 11. The British Withdrawal and the Handover to the Zionists. On March 10, 1948, 2 months before the official end of the British Mandate, the Zionist leadership finalized a meticulous strategy known as Plan Dalet. This was not a plan for traditional warfare. It was a blueprint for the systematic depopulation of Palestinian villages. The goal was to instill a terror so profound that resistance would become unthinkable. Zionist militias prioritized fear over military superiority, executing prisoners on the spot to ensure that the news of their brutality would paralyze neighboring regions. The tactics were as calculated as they were cruel. Villages were typically surrounded on three sides and subjected to heavy bombardment. One side was left open, not for mercy, but as a deliberate escape route to funnel panicked residents away from their homes. This forced displacement began along the Mediterranean coast and moved eastward, securing the sea for the fledgling state. In this initial phase alone, 350,000 Palestinians were driven from their lands. The methods used to achieve this were horrifying. Zionist units deployed market bombings, car explosions, and roadside ambushes. Some operatives, disguised as Arabs, carried out covert assassinations, while others deliberately contaminated water supplies with bacteria. In the most extreme cases, entire villages were set ablaze with the inhabitants trapped inside. Mane can begin with later boast that the massacre at Deir Yassin was the key to spreading this terror, famously stating that it allowed cities like Haifa to fall as effortlessly as a knife slicing through butter. Haifa fell in April 1948, facilitated by a coordinated handover between the British and the Zionists. A vibrant commercial hub of 70,000 Arabs was reduced to a mere 4,000 through a campaign of relentless shelling. Days later, Jaffa met the same fate. Zionist artillery was positioned to bombard the city until its 70,000 residents had no choice but to flee. The pattern was identical across Safed, Beisan, and the Galilee. British forces would prematurely withdraw from strategic locations, meticulously timing their exit so that Zionist militias could step in before any Arab defense could be organized. While Britain barred Arab armies from entering until the final day of the mandate, the defenseless Palestinian people were left to face tens of thousands of highly trained and heavily armed soldiers. As each city fell, waves of refugees poured out into the unknown. Stripped of their resources and their leadership, they wandered toward the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, or Syria. Many perished along the way from hunger, exhaustion, or the elements, finding no sanctuary but the shade of rocks or the depths of caves. On May 14, 1948, the British formally departed. David Ben-Gurion stood beneath a portrait of Theodor Herzl and proclaimed the independence of the State of Israel. 40 years after Herzl had sown the seeds of his vision, the dream of a Zionist state was realized on the ruins of a shattered society. This event marked more than just a military victory. It was the fulfillment of a harrowing chapter where an ancient land was forcibly taken. As the State of Israel was declared, a new era of struggle began for the Palestinians, the Arab world, and the entire international community. A chapter written in the blood and displacement of a people whose only crime was living on the land of their ancestors. Chapter 12. The 1948 Nakba, Resistance Against the Odds. Despite 3 decades of unparalleled support from the British Empire, the Zionist conquest of Palestine was far from effortless. It was met with a fierce and desperate resistance by a people who, despite being besieged by famine, betrayal, and a lack of resources, fought with remarkable courage. To understand this turbulent period, we must look at the 3 levels of resistance that stood against the Zionist tide. The first level was the internal Palestinian resistance, led primarily by the Holy Jihad movement under the leadership of Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini. The second was the Arab Liberation Army, a force of volunteers organized by the Arab League. The third and final level was the official Arab armies, which entered the conflict only after the British mandate had officially ended. A common myth persists that a small Jewish state was besieged by massive, well-equipped Arab nations. The reality was the exact opposite. Whether acting independently or together, these 3 levels of resistance were vastly under-resourced. They lacked ammunition, military training, and the robust logistical expertise that the Zionists had perfected during World War II. The Arab regimes of the time were still puppet states, their armies often led by foreign officers and their policies dictated by colonial interests. The people of Palestine were effectively stripped of the right to defend their own home. As the ones most familiar with the terrain and the enemy, They were best positioned to lead the fight. All they required from the Arab states was financial and military support. Had the resistance been left to the Palestinians, it would have shattered the Zionist propaganda that portrayed Israel as a struggling underdog. Instead, the direct intervention of fragmented Arab regimes played into the Zionist narrative while leading to a catastrophic military failure. Adding to this tragedy was a vacuum of political leadership on the ground. The most recognized Palestinian leader, Haj Amin al-Husseini, was barred from entering the country by the Egyptian authorities. This absence left the resistance without a unified political head at its most critical hour. History reveals that the policies and military failures of the surrounding Arab regimes were not just accidental. They were instrumental in enabling and solidifying the establishment of the Zionist state on Palestinian soil. The Nakba was not just a loss of territory. It was the result of a deliberate dismantling of a people's ability to defend themselves, leaving the brave to fight a war that had been politically lost before the first shot was even fired. Chapter 13. The Holy Jihad Movement. The Legend of Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini. In the summer of 1946, in a quiet meeting in Cairo, the seeds of one of the most successful organized resistances in Palestinian history were sown. Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini, a veteran of the Great Revolt, met with the Mufti, Amin al-Husseini. Together, they formed the Holy Jihad Movement, a force designed not just to fight, but to protect the very fabric of Palestinian society. Abd al-Qadir was a leader who led from the front. He traveled through the villages of Palestine, leveraging his stellar reputation to recruit young men into a highly structured organization. The movement was a sophisticated machine, featuring specialized units for intelligence, logistics, and regional combat. Most importantly, it included units dedicated to land protection, tracking brokers who sold land to Zionist entities and enforcing boycotts against those who collaborated with the enemy. Jerusalem was the movement's heart and headquarters. Abd al-Qadir understood that the city was the decisive battleground. If Jerusalem fell, the Zionist project would secure its crown. His fighters had an advantage no foreign army possessed. They were sons of the soil, fighting on a terrain they knew by heart, against an enemy they understood intimately. Yet, the Holy Jihad Army faced an enemy more treacherous than the Zionist militias: Arab complicity. From its inception, the Arab League worked to undermine Abd al-Qadir. They feared his independence and sought to leash his resistance. They imposed restrictive conditions, barring him from collecting local funds and attempting to confine his operations to the Jerusalem area alone. The tragedy reached its peak in April 1948. While the Arab Liberation Army in Damascus refused to supply him with weapons, the strategically vital village of Al-Kastal fell to Zionist forces. Al-Kastal was the lifeline, the key supply route between the port of Jaffa and the settlements of Jerusalem. Without hesitation, Abd al-Qadir rushed back from Damascus to reclaim the heights. He succeeded in liberating Al-Kastal, but the victory came at the ultimate price. On April 8, 1948, the Lion of Palestine was martyred. 2 days before his death, he had sent a haunting letter to the Arab League Secretary General, stating, "I hold you responsible for abandoning my soldiers at the height of their victories, without support or weapons." The blow was catastrophic. Just 1 day after his martyrdom, as his funeral procession moved through the streets, news broke of the horrific massacre at Deir Yassin. The fall of Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini was not just the loss of commander. It was the silencing of the most effective Palestinian voice on the battlefield, leaving the road to Jerusalem open and the spirit of the resistance deeply wounded at its most critical hour. Chapter 14. The Arab Liberation Army, a mechanism of control. As the fires of 1948 loomed, a wave of fervor swept across the Arab world. Thousands of volunteers were ready to sacrifice everything for Palestine. To channel and ultimately contain this energy, Arab regimes created the Arab Liberation Army. But what was presented as a force of salvation was, in reality, a calculated mechanism of control. The first act of this conspiracy was to ban any independent volunteering, forcing every willing fighter under the direct authority of a command structure that was more interested in politics than victory. The army's leadership was a study in contradiction. At the top were three seasoned figures: Ismail Safwat, Taha al-Hashimi, and a legendary guerrilla expert Fawzi al-Kawukji. On paper, they were masters of war. On the ground in Palestine, they were a disaster. Safwat and al-Hashimi had never even set foot in Palestine and were entirely unfamiliar with its rugged terrain. Worse still, the leadership was paralyzed by mutual mistrust and a deep-seated rivalry with the Palestinian leader, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. The Arab League intentionally sidelined the Mufti and his holy jihad fighters. While the Mufti argued for arming the local Palestinians who knew the land best, the Arab Liberation Army leadership insisted on regular military tactics that were slow, rigid, and entirely ill-suited for a volunteer struggle. This internal discord was a gift to the Zionist militias. The mission of the army remained a mystery even to its own soldiers. Were they there to fight, to support the locals, or simply to wait for the official armies? This ambiguity led to a series of catastrophic errors. Recruitment was abruptly halted despite thousands of eager volunteers. The men who were accepted were often poorly vetted, leading to incidents of looting and, more dangerously, infiltration by Zionist spies. Training was conducted as if for a parade ground, not a guerrilla war, leaving the volunteers helpless as events on the ground moved with lightning speed. On the battlefield, the failures were even more glaring. The leadership restricted operations to areas designated for Arabs under the UN partition plan, effectively abandoning cities like Jaffa and Haifa to their fate. Even as Deir Yassin was being slaughtered, the Arab Liberation Army, stationed nearby, did not move. In some of the most shameful episodes of the war, the army actually disarmed Palestinian villagers, promising to protect them, only to retreat at the first sight of a Zionist advance, leaving the communities defenseless. The ultimate tragedy of the Arab Liberation Army was its treatment of Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini. In his final hours, as he begged for weapons to defend Jerusalem, the leadership in Damascus turned him away with contempt. His parting words to them were a haunting prophecy: "You are traitors, you are criminals, and history will record that you lost Palestine." Many who fought in its ranks, like Sheikh Mustafa al-Sabai, concluded that the army was never meant to win. It was created to pacify Arab public opinion and to dismantle the independent Palestinian resistance. Yet, despite this leadership of betrayal and incompetence, the sheer bravery of the volunteers and the Palestinian people meant that they still held 82% of the land before the official Arab armies ever crossed the border. The tragedy was not a lack of courage from the people, but a lack of integrity from those who claimed to lead them. Chapter 15. The Arab Armies, a victory foreclosed. The entry of the official Arab armies into Palestine on May 15, 1948, is often portrayed as a massive invasion. In reality, it was a tragedy of timing, coordination, and diluted sovereignty. Britain had strictly prohibited these armies from crossing the border until the very second their mandate expired. This delay was fatal. By the time the first Arab tank rolled forward, the Zionists had already seized the most strategic cities and depopulated hundreds of villages. The disparity in numbers was the first great deception. While propaganda spoke of a mighty Arab coalition, the combined Arab forces initially totaled just 25,000 men. They faced a Zionist military that began with 35,000 and swelled to nearly 100,000 by the end of the year. The Zionists were veterans of World War II, fighting with modern intelligence and a unified command. The Arab armies, by contrast, were nascent forces of states with only a veneer of independence, still shackled by their colonial ties to Britain. The lack of coordination reached the point of absurdity. The Iraqi army was deployed to mountainous regions with heavy tanks that couldn't climb the slopes, while the Egyptian army fought in open plains without any armor at all. There were stories of one army having the guns but no shells, while another had the shells but no guns. This was not just incompetence. It was a structural failure of trust. As one historian noted, the Arabs entered Palestine fighting each other as much as they fought the Jewish state. Perhaps the greatest irony lay in the leadership. The supreme commander of the Arab forces was King Abdullah of Jordan, a man who had already secretly accepted the partition plan. His own army was led by a British officer, Ghalib Pasha, who was in constant contact with Zionist leaders. This led to the infamous response often given to Palestinian cries for help. Mako Awamir. We have no orders. Every time the Arab forces gained a tactical advantage, the United Nations would impose a ceasefire. The Arab regimes, subservient to international pressure, would immediately stop. The Zionists, however, used these truces to smuggle in massive shipments of arms and thousands of new recruits. By the time the fighting resumed, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. In the end, the Arab intervention did not save Palestine. It facilitated its loss. The Egyptian army was led into simple military traps, while the Jordanian army focused more on annexing the West Bank than on liberating the land. When the dust settled, Israel held 78% of Palestine, far more than the UN had originally granted. For the 800,000 refugees who fled their homes, the entry of the Arab armies had been their last flicker of hope. They left their doors unlocked, carrying their keys, believing the big brothers would restore them in a matter of days. Instead, they found themselves in an exile that would last for generations. The Nakba was completed not just by the strength of the enemy, but by the chains of the allies. Chapter 16. Israel, Consolidation and Expansion, 1948 to 1967. Immediately following its birth in 1948, the Zionist state secured rapid recognition from the world superpowers. But international approval was not enough for David Ben-Gurion. In a move that defied even his own allies, he declared Jerusalem the capital of Israel, swiftly relocating government ministries to the Holy City. While embassies remained in Tel Aviv, the message was clear: Israel was creating facts on the ground that the world would be forced to accept. From its first day, the state's overarching priority was security, or more accurately, the projection of ironclad military deterrence. Having been founded on the displacement of the land's original inhabitants, Israel used a strategy of extreme violence and intimidation to ensure that those displaced would never dare to return. By the mid-1950s, Israel's ambitions grew beyond its 1948 borders. The Suez Crisis of 1956, known as the tripartite aggression, provided the perfect stage. Under the pretext of the nationalization of the Suez Canal, Israel joined forces with the old colonial powers, Britain and France, to launch a massive assault on Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Though diplomatic pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union eventually forced a withdrawal, Israel emerged as the true strategic victor. The war achieved three critical objectives. First, it demonstrated that Israel could strike and defeat the largest Arab army at will. Second, it secured freedom of navigation through the Gulf of Aqaba, opening a vital maritime lifeline to the south. And third, it led to the stationing of international monitors on the Egyptian border, effectively stripping Egypt of the element of surprise in any future conflict. Perhaps most dangerous of all was Israel's invisible war. During these years, the Mossad successfully infiltrated the highest echelons of Arab governments. Agents like Eli Cohen, who nearly became the vice president of Syria, and figures close to the Egyptian presidency, provided a constant stream of high-level intelligence. By 1967, Israel was no longer just a fledgling state fighting for survival. It had become a regional power with expansionist eyes on the West Bank and Gaza. The relative ease of the Sinai campaign had emboldened its leadership, setting the stage for a lightning strike that would once again reshape the map of the Middle East and deepen the tragedy of the Palestinian people. Chapter 17. Palestine between two catastrophes: identity and betrayal. In the wake of the 1948 Nakba, the Palestinian people found themselves caught between a fragmenting past and an uncertain future. As the Islamic Caliphate fell and secular ideologies like communism and liberalism swept the globe, a new Middle East emerged, one defined by borders, flags, and nationalisms. Yet, for Palestinians, their identity remained stubbornly tied to the broader Arab world. They didn't view the liberation of their land as a local struggle, but as a shared Arab destiny. This period saw the rise of Nasserism in Egypt and the Ba'ath Party in Syria, movements that used powerful rhetoric to promise the unity of the Arab nation and the liberation of Jerusalem. For a society drained by decades of British occupation, these slogans offered a lifeline of hope. However, behind the fiery speeches, the reality was starkly different. Arab regimes began to treat the Palestinian cause not as a duty, but as a political tool to bolster their own power. When the All-Palestine government was proclaimed in Gaza in 1948, it was immediately undermined. King Abdullah of Jordan refused to recognize it, while the Egyptian government forcibly relocated its leaders to Cairo, transforming a sovereign government into a symbolic entity in exile, kept under strict surveillance. While holding control over Gaza and the West Bank, the Egyptian and Jordanian regimes worked to suppress the very resistance they claimed to support. Their security apparatuses monitored and imprisoned young Palestinians who attempted to infiltrate the borders of the new Zionist state. This was a period where the independent Arab states often acted as the silent protectors of Israel's borders, silencing any voice that dared to challenge the status quo through direct action. Under this weight of despair, Palestinian society underwent a profound transformation. Fragmented and dispersed, education became their new battlefield. Deprived of their lands and properties, Palestinians emerged as one of the most educated populations in the Arab world, seeking opportunities in the booming Gulf states or in Western universities. In 1957, within the growing Palestinian community in Kuwait, a new movement was born, Fatah. Initially rooted in Islamic principles and supported by the youth of the Muslim Brotherhood, it slowly evolved into a secular movement, filling the political vacuum left by the declining Arab Higher Committee. The story of Palestine between 1948 and 1967 is one of the people betrayed by those who promised them salvation. In every Arab country they sought refuge, Palestinians faced marginalization and exclusion, often treated as a liability rather than a supportive base. They were a people enduring the humiliation of the refugee camps, yet simultaneously building the intellectual and organizational foundations of a resistance that would eventually rise independent of the regimes that had failed them. Chapter 18. The Arab World After the Nakba, a landscape of upheaval. The 1948 Nakba was not just the loss of land. It was a seismic shock that shattered the political foundations of the entire Arab world. In its wake, a violent wave of coups, assassinations, and revolutions swept the region. As the influence of Britain and France waned, the United States and the Soviet Union stepped in, turning the Middle East into a theater for their Cold War rivalry. But despite the change from monarchies to republics, one grim reality remained constant. The plight of the Palestinian people continued to be exploited while their land remained occupied. Egypt, the age of oppression and defeats. In Egypt, the dust of the war had barely settled when the authorities launched a brutal crackdown. Not on the Zionists, but on the Muslim Brotherhood, the very volunteers who had fought most fiercely in Palestine. The regime's logic was chilling. The Brotherhood is more dangerous than the Zionists. This paved the way for the 1952 military coup led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser's era was defined by soaring rhetoric and passionate slogans about liberation, yet became a period of stagnation and military humiliation. Under his rule, Egypt lost Sudan, failed in its union with Syria, and suffered a devastating defeat in 1956. Behind the grand speeches, Nasser focused his military might on securing his own authoritarian rule, keeping the borders with Israel silent while his prisons were filled with his own people. Syria, the era of the coup. Syria entered a dark cycle of instability, witnessing 4 military coups in just 2 years. These upheavals served more as instruments for foreign influence than as a means to liberate Palestine. Even the democratic spring of the mid-50s was short-lived, crushed by the Ba'ath Party's rise to power. The tragedy of Syria was epitomized by its first coup leader, Hosni al-Zaim, who secretly offered Israel a full peace deal and the resettlement of 300,000 refugees, a proposal rejected by Ben-Gurion only because his territorial ambitions were even greater than the peace being offered. Jordan, the strategy of calculated deception. While Egypt and Syria faced constant turnover, Jordan remained remarkably stable. But this stability was built on the most complex alignment with foreign interests. After the assassination of King Abdullah I on the steps of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the first ruler to pay the price for his secret dealings, the throne eventually passed to his grandson, Hussein. The Jordanian regime developed a unique model of soft containment. Governing a majority Palestinian population, it used its sophisticated intelligence apparatus not to liberate the West Bank, but to neutralize any genuine resistance. Jordan became Israel's most reliable safeguard, sharing the longest border and maintaining deep, strategic ties with both Washington and Tel Aviv. It was a regime that spoke the language of Arab nationalism, while its security was guaranteed by those it claimed to oppose. The bitter conclusion. Across the Arab world, the pattern was the same. The Palestinian cause was reduced to a bargaining chip, used by regimes to bolster their own power and suppress internal dissent. These states did not pursue true unity. They pursued the consolidation of their local borders. The refugees in their camps were treated as a liability, barred from meaningful resistance, and often subjected to more persecution by Arab governments than by foreign occupiers. By the mid-1960s, the Arab world was a house divided, led by regimes that prioritized their own survival over the liberation they promised. This internal decay, corruption, and betrayal led directly to a second catastrophe, a disaster even more devastating than the first, the Nakba of 1967. Chapter 19. The 1967 Nakba, the Six-Day Collapse. Nearly 6 decades have passed since the 1967 war, yet its events remain one of the most guarded secrets in Arab history. It was a catastrophe that no one, not even the most cynical observer, could have predicted. In just 6 hours, the dreams of a generation were shattered, and in 6 days, the map of the Middle East was redrawn. The conflict began with a series of dramatic gestures by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. He closed the Strait of Tiran and demanded the withdrawal of UN forces from the border. To the Arab public, these were signals of an imminent and glorious liberation. But behind the rhetoric, there was a void. There were no substantial war preparations. Reservists were sent to the front without training or clear objectives. It was a strategy of brinkmanship that backfired with historic consequences. On the morning of June 5, 1967, the disaster unfolded. The Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground, left exposed on runways as if awaiting its own annihilation. Without air cover, the Egyptian army in Sinai was ordered to retreat in total disarray. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. 10,000 soldiers were killed, and thousands more were captured, executed, or left to wander the desert in a state of total collapse. While the military disintegrated, the media continued to broadcast lies of imaginary victories, claiming Arab tanks were nearing Tel Aviv. The shock only broke on June 9th, when a somber Nasser admitted defeat and resigned. Yet, in a masterstroke of political theater, he returned to power through orchestrated protests, subsequently purging his rivals, including his lifelong friend and army commander, Abdul Hakim Amr. The tragedy extended far beyond Sinai. In Syria, the Golan Heights, a natural fortress, fell with terrifying ease. In Jordan, King Hussein, who had maintained secret ties with Israeli leaders and even received advance warnings of their plans, watched as the West Bank was seized. The most painful blow was the fall of Jerusalem. For the first time, Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site, passed under Israeli occupation. The Moroccan quarter was demolished within days, its residents expelled to make way for a prayer plaza at the Western Wall. By June 27th, Israel declared a unified Jerusalem, beginning a campaign of excavations beneath the mosque and the establishment of settlements that continue to this day. The 1967 Nakba was different from 1948. In 1948, the Arabs were weak and under occupation. In 1967, they were independent nations led by a charismatic leader who promised strength. The sudden collapse revealed the hollow nature of the regimes and the corruption within their ranks. Israel emerged not just as a state, but as a regional superpower, holding territories from 4 Arab nations and controlling the entirety of historic Palestine. The age of oppression and defeats had reached its zenith, leaving a wounded nation and a holy city under a new and enduring occupation. Chapter 20: The Fall of Pan-Arabism and the Return to Faith. History teaches us that ideologies thrive on triumph and wither in defeat. The catastrophe of 1967 was more than a military failure. It was a fatal blow to the secular ideologies that had dominated the Arab world for decades. Nasserism, Pan-Arabism, and the flirtation with communism, which had promised dignity and unity, were revealed to be hollow in the wake of the crushing Six-Day Collapse. In the years leading up to the war, the region had witnessed an aggressive shift towards secularism. State-controlled media often sidelined religious values, and in some military publications, bold declarations were made that faith had become a relic of the past. Carrying a religious book could brand an individual as an outcast. But as the smoke cleared over Sinai and Jerusalem, the society that had been enamored with the persona of a single leader found itself in a state of profound disillusionment. The Second Nakba brought about 3 transformative shifts. First, the decisive collapse of Nasserism. The military failure eroded the credibility of a leadership that had promised liberation but delivered a historic retreat. This vacuum led to the second major shift, the revival of Islamic thought. In the depths of defeat, many in Egypt and the Levant began to return to their religious roots, seeking a framework for identity and resistance that secular nationalism had failed to provide. Thirdly, the defeat triggered a profound change in the Palestinian psyche. Having watched their homeland fall while under the protection of ineffective Arab armies, Palestinians felt a deep sense of betrayal. They realized that waiting for Arab regimes to save them was a path to nowhere. This disillusionment fueled a fierce new Palestinian nationalism, a movement that sought direct, armed confrontation with the occupation, independent of the shifting interests of Arab capitals. For the first time, even the Egyptian government, previously suspicious of any independent militia, was forced to allow limited cooperation with Palestinian resistance groups. The regional landscape had been permanently reshaped. The era of the charismatic savior was over, replaced by a more fragmented, yet more direct struggle. The path to Jerusalem was no longer seen through the lens of grand Arab summits, but through the eyes of a people who had decided to take their destiny into their own hands. Chapter 21: Israel, the unchallenged regional power. The 1967 war was more than a military victory. It was the moment Israel transformed from a fragile experiment into the preeminent power of the Middle East. If 1948 was about survival under British patronage, 1967 was the proof of independent, autonomous strength. By defeating 3 Arab armies simultaneously, Israel didn't just expand its borders. It silenced the international doubts about its long-term viability. This victory fundamentally altered the global colonial calculus. Before 1967, superpowers like the United States debated whether to invest their interests in Israel or in larger regional players like Egypt, Turkey, or Iran. The Six-Day War ended that debate. Israel proved it could outperform nations with far greater resources and populations, positioning itself as the primary guardian of Western interests in the region. The territorial gains of 1948 were now cemented. From this point forward, international diplomacy would no longer question Israel's existence, but only where its 1967 borders should lie. The war also brought a second wave of displacement, with 300,000 more Palestinians forced from their homes. Yet, the scale was different from 1948. This time, Palestinians had learned a bitter lesson. Displacement was not temporary. Many chose to stand their ground, refusing to believe the promises of a swift return. But Israel's conquest wasn't just physical. By seizing the intelligence archives of Egypt and Jordan, the Israeli security apparatus gained a terrifying windfall of information. They now held the names, locations, and networks of the Palestinian resistance. This, combined with the profound psychological demoralization of the Arab world, allowed Israel to systematically dismantle the resistance movements within the occupied territories. The irony of the 1967 victory was so absolute that some observers at the time joked that Israel should erect a statue of Gamal Abdel Nasser. They argued that his policies, his rhetoric, and his strategic failures provided the perfect environment for Israel to achieve its most monumental success. By 1973, through a combination of military force and psychological pressure, Israel had effectively neutralized its neighbors, carving out an unchallenged position that would reshape the Middle East for decades to come. Chapter 22. The October War, Between Liberation and Negotiation. In the years following the 1967 disaster, a war of attrition simmered along the Suez Canal. Egypt, now under the leadership of Anwar Sadat, lived in a state of no war, no peace. But in 1973, Sadat decided to break the stalemate. On October 6th, in a meticulously planned surprise attack, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and shattered the supposedly invincible Bar-Lev line. Simultaneously, Syrian forces surged into the Golan Heights. For the first time in decades, the Arab world felt the rush of victory. But as the days passed, the strategic landscape began to shift. In the north, Israel regained the upper hand, repelling Syrian forces and striking deep toward Damascus. On the Egyptian front, a fateful decision by Sadat altered the course of history. Overruling his military commanders, he ordered a deeper advance into Sinai, beyond the protective shield of Egyptian air defense. The result was a catastrophe known as the Tank Massacre, which created a gap in the lines that Israeli forces exploited to cross back to the western side of the canal, encircling the Egyptian Third Army. The war ended in a military stalemate, but it opened the door for a political earthquake. Historians still debate Sadat's true intentions. Was this a genuine attempt to liberate all occupied lands? Or was it, as many commanders later claimed, a limited operation designed only to shock Israel into a peace process? Sadat's own words, "I only need you to liberate 10 centimeters east of the canal," suggested that for him, the war was merely a bloody introduction to diplomacy. Sadat's shift was radical. He pivoted Egypt away from the Soviet Union and into the American sphere, declaring that the October War would be the last war. While Israel eventually withdrew from the Sinai, it did so only after securing a peace treaty that neutralized the largest Arab army and fractured the unified Arab front. To many Palestinians, this felt like a second betrayal. They had fought alongside the official armies, carrying out nearly 100 guerrilla operations during the conflict, only to see their cause sidelined by state interests. The path that began with the roar of cannons in 1973 ended with the stroke of a pen in 1979. Egypt had regained its land, but a profound cost to the collective Arab struggle. As Israel officially exited Sinai, it effectively entered Cairo through the gate of normalization. The path to surrender, as critics called it, had begun, reshaping the Middle East into a region where the struggle for Palestine would now be fought not by official armies, but by the people themselves standing alone against an unchallenged regional power. Chapter 23. The Great Shift, From Confrontation to Normalization. To many, Anwar Sadat's 1977 visit to Jerusalem seemed like a sudden, inexplicable rupture in history. But the seeds of peace had been quietly sown long before. From King Farouk's early overtures to the clandestine meetings between Zionist leaders and King Abdullah of Jordan, the path to normalization was a bridge built in the shadows. Yet, in a region where the mere mention of peace was seen as high treason, Sadat was the first to bring these hidden ties into the blinding light of the world stage. Sadat's rationale was grounded in a new, cold realism. He famously claimed that America held 99% of the cards in the Middle East. By 1979, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty was signed, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the region. Sinai was returned to Egypt, but it became a demilitarized buffer zone, a shield for Israeli security rather than a platform for Egyptian defense. More importantly, the treaty marked Egypt's formal withdrawal from the pan-Arab struggle. The cause of Palestine, once the central heartbeat of Cairo's policy, was relegated to a local issue for the Palestinians to face alone. The shockwaves of this shift were felt immediately. In 1981, Sadat paid the ultimate price for his gamble, assassinated by soldiers during a military parade. His death sent a chilling message to Arab leaders, freezing overt normalization for decades. While Hosni Mubarak maintained a cold peace for 30 years, keeping the treaty intact while the public remained hostile, other regimes continued the dance in the shadows. Normalization eventually branched into three paths: the public treaties of Egypt and later Jordan in 1994, the covert, strategic relationships with kingdoms like Morocco, and the public peace initiatives led by Saudi Arabia, which offered recognition in exchange for a return to the 1967 borders, offers that Israel repeatedly ignored. Today, we are witnessing a new, more aggressive wave of this shift. Led by the UAE and followed by Bahrain and Morocco, the Abraham Accords have moved normalization from the dark corridors of intelligence agencies to the bright lights of economic and cultural exchange. With discussions now surrounding the potential normalization of Saudi Arabia, the custodian of Islam's holiest sites, the regional landscape is on the verge of its most significant transformation since 1948. The story that began with a struggle for existence has evolved into a complex web of alliances. As official Arab support for the armed liberation of Palestine fades into history, the burden of the cause has returned to where it perhaps always belonged, in the hands of the Palestinian people themselves, standing at the crossroads of a region that is rapidly choosing interest over identity. Chapter 24. Palestine, the Orphan Cause. The withdrawal of Egypt from the Arab-Israeli conflict was not merely the exit of a single nation. It was the collapse of the Arab world's strategic spine, representing a quarter of the Arab population and its most formidable military force. Egypt's shift toward a separate peace left the Palestinian cause politically orphaned. For the first time since the British Mandate, Palestine stood alone, severed from the broader Arab and Islamic identity that had once been its primary shield. The repercussions of the 1979 peace treaty were immediate and devastating. Neutralizing Egypt acted as a green light for Israel to dominate the region unchecked. Within just 3 years of the accord, Israel felt emboldened to declare Jerusalem its eternal, undivided capital, bomb Iraq's nuclear reactor, and launch a full-scale invasion of Lebanon. The tragedy reached its peak in the streets of Beirut, where the Sabra and Shatila massacre claimed the lives of thousands of Palestinian refugees, while the official Arab world, led by a neutralized Egypt, watched in paralyzed silence. The Egyptian regime, which had once governed Gaza, now relegated the Strip to being an exclusively Palestinian matter. This fragmentation was the final step in a long process of abandonment. First, the fall of the Islamic Caliphate dismantled the religious framework of responsibility. Then, Arab nationalist regimes replaced action with empty slogans, eventually surrendering the remainder of historic Palestine in 1967. Finally, the era of normalization entrenched the surrender as Arab leaders prioritized securing their own political power over the liberation of Jerusalem. In the occupied territories, Israel exploited this isolation. They intensified settlement construction, appropriated vital resources, and attempted to reshape the Palestinian social fabric to accept the occupation as a permanent reality. But this peace was a delusion. Instead of breaking the Palestinian spirit, the abandonment by Arab regimes forced a profound realization. Reclaiming the homeland required absolute self-reliance. In an almost impossible battle against a global military power and the betrayal of their closest neighbors, the Palestinian people did not surrender. Instead, they began to prepare for their most powerful wave of defiance yet. In the era of normalization and treaties, a new generation was rising, one that understood that when the world turns its back, the only path forward is the one you forge yourself. The era of resistance, an unyielding spirit. Throughout history, many conquerors have succeeded in obliterating the cultures of the peoples they subdued. From the indigenous populations of the Americas to the lost communities of Andalusia, history is filled with stories of nations that were erased or absorbed under the weight of overwhelming power. Palestine could have easily suffered a similar fate, becoming another forgotten chapter in the annals of colonization. Yet, Palestine possessed something the others did not, a spiritual anchor that no military force could dismantle. At its heart lies Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, sacred landmarks woven into the very fabric of the Islamic faith. These holy sites provided more than just a sense of place. They offered an unyielding source of resolve. This deep connection to the divine fortified the Palestinian people during moments of darkness that would have led others to complete cultural erasure. In the early decades of the struggle, the resistance was a tapestry of different ideologies, some secular, some nationalist, and some Islamic. For a time, non-religious factions led the way on the world stage. But as the political tides shifted and some movements weakened or even collaborated with the occupation, the leadership of the resistance began to gravitate toward its most enduring foundation. The cause of Jerusalem is a cause of faith, and this spiritual depth gradually steered the struggle back toward its Islamic roots. While other ideologies faltered or compromised under the pressure of global politics, the Islamic movements remained steadfast, viewing the resistance not just as a political battle, but as a sacred duty. Today, this foundation remains the cornerstone of Palestinian defiance. It is a spirit that refuses to be crushed, even when abandoned by brothers and besieged by enemies. In a world of shifting alliances and broken promises, the era of resistance continues, driven by a people who believe that as long as Al-Aqsa stands, the hope for liberation will never die. The rise of the Patriots, the era of independent resistance. After the 1956 war, the Palestinian cause faced a dangerous lull. Arab regimes had largely silenced the volunteer efforts of the past. But in the shadows of Kuwait in 1957, a new force was born, Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat and Khalil al-Wazir. This movement was fueled by a bitter realization that the liberation of Palestine could no longer wait for the empty promises of Arab unity or the mobilization of Arab armies. Fatah's roots were complex. Many of its founders, including Arafat and Abu Jihad, emerged from the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood. Yet, as the Brotherhood faced crushing repression in Egypt and Syria, and as Fatah sought to build a broad national front, the movement transitioned from its Islamist origins into a secular nationalist organization. While Islamists retreated into educational and social work, believing that a true Islamic state must precede liberation, the patriots of Fatah argued that the struggle must begin now, led by Palestinians themselves. Chapter 25: The Golden Age and the Battle of Karameh. The years between 1967 and 1970 marked the golden age of Palestinian resistance. Nowhere was this more evident than in Jordan. Following the 1967 defeat, the Palestinian resistance established deep roots along the Jordan River. This era reached its zenith on March 21, 1968, with the Battle of Karameh. For the first time, Palestinian Fedayeen, supported by the Jordanian army, repelled a massive Israeli incursion. It was a victory that shattered the myth of Israeli invincibility and drew tens of thousands of volunteers to the cause. Black September, the tragic turn. However, with success came a dangerous overconfidence. Fatah's influence in Jordan grew so rapidly that it began to challenge the sovereignty of the monarchy. Secular and leftist slogans often clashed with local traditional values, and the hijacking of planes to Jordanian airfields pushed King Hussein to his limit. In September 1970, known as Black September, the Jordanian army launched a devastating offensive to crush the resistance. Thousands were killed, and the Palestinian movement was expelled from its most vital base of operations. Lebanon, the new frontier. With Jordan closed, the resistance shifted to Lebanon, the only remaining frontier. Though the border was narrow, Lebanon's fractured sectarian landscape allowed the PLO to operate with a freedom it never had elsewhere. Under the 1969 Cairo Agreement, the Fedayeen launched daring operations, such as the 1975 Savoy Hotel raid in Tel Aviv. Meanwhile, factions like the PFLP took the struggle to the global stage through high-profile plane hijackings and international hostage-taking, ensuring that the world could no longer ignore the Palestinian plight. International recognition. By 1974, the struggle had achieved its greatest political milestone. In Rabat, Arab states officially recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, a decision some leaders reportedly accepted only under the shadow of threats. Weeks later, Yasser Arafat stood before the United Nations General Assembly, telling the world, "I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." The Palestinian cause had been elevated from a refugee crisis to a national liberation movement. But as the 1970s drew to a close, the resistance found itself caught in a pincer movement between a relentless Israeli military and the shifting, often treacherous interests of the Arab states. The stage was set for the next tragic chapter in Lebanon, the invasion of 1982. Chapter 26. The Awakening, the First Intifada and the Rise of Hamas. By the 1980s, the Palestinian struggle reached a crossroads. The secular movements that had led for decades were in retreat, exiled to Tunisia after the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. A vacuum emerged, but it was quickly filled by a silent coup, the Islamic Awakening. Fueled by the tectonic shifts of 1979, the Iranian Revolution and the Afghan Jihad, a new generation of Palestinians began to ask, if others can defeat superpowers with faith, why can't we? The birth of a movement. For years, the Islamic movement in Palestine had focused on building the individual through mosques and charity. But figures like Dr. Fathi al-Shakaki and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin realized that piety without resistance was incomplete. In 1987, the tension snapped. A Zionist truck driver killed 4 Palestinian workers in Gaza, sparking a fire that no one could extinguish. The Intifada of stones had begun. Out of this fury, the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, was officially born. Unlike the PLO, which had begun to signal a willingness to compromise for a two-state solution, Hamas revived the original, uncompromising vision, the liberation of all Palestine, from the river to the sea, viewed not just as a political right, but as a sacred religious duty. The Intifada of mosques. The uprising was not led from luxury offices in foreign capitals. It was led from the minarets. Every Friday prayer became a launch pad for defiance. Israel responded with the brutal broken bones policy, attempting to crush the hands of stone-throwing children. Yet, for every bone broken, a new cell was formed. By 1990, the movement evolved from stones to steel, establishing the Izz al-Din al-Qassam brigades. The double betrayal. As the people bled on the streets, a political drama unfolded in the palaces. In 1988, King Hussein of Jordan announced his disengagement from the West Bank, effectively washing his hands of the territory. This move was a double-edged sword. It allowed the PLO to claim sole representation, but it also pushed them toward the ultimate concession. In a 1988 conference in Algiers, the PLO leadership accepted the UN partition plan, essentially recognizing the legitimacy of a Zionist state on 1948 lands. To the youth in the streets, this felt like a second Nakba, this time at the hands of their own leadership. While the PLO pursued the mirage of diplomacy, the Islamic movements entrenched themselves in the reality of resistance. The First Intifada proved that the Palestinian people had seized the initiative. They no longer waited for Arab armies or Western resolutions. They had learned that in a world of betrayal and normalization, Their only true allies were their faith and their own steadfastness. The era of the peace of the brave was approaching, but beneath the surface, the seeds of an even greater confrontation were being sown. The Great Concession. The 1993 Oslo Accords were a seismic shift. For the first time, the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist on 78% of historic Palestine. In return, the Palestinians received no state, no sovereignty, and no guarantee for Jerusalem or the refugees. Instead, they were granted the Palestinian Authority, a limited administrative body tasked with managing civil life and, most crucially, ensuring Israeli security. This was the birth of a cost-free occupation. Israel outsourced the burden of policing Palestinians to Palestinians themselves. Under the leadership of figures like Mahmoud Abbas, the architect of Oslo, and security chiefs like Mohammed Dalan and Jabril Rajoub, the authority's security apparatus grew to be one of the largest per capita in the world. Its primary mandate? Security coordination, a term that many Palestinians viewed as outright collaboration to suppress the rising Islamic resistance. The engineer in the era of martyrdom. While the authority focused on diplomacy and suppression, a new form of resistance was being forged in the shadows. A young engineer named Yehya Ayash revolutionized the struggle. Using local materials and immense ingenuity, he introduced the martyrdom operations, striking deep within Israeli cities. Ayash became a symbol of defiance, but he also became a target of the very authority that claimed to represent his people. In 1996, the security collaboration bore its most bitter fruit. Ayash was assassinated via a rigged cell phone provided by collaborator. His death sparked a wave of retaliation that shook the foundations of the peace process. The internal schism. The Oslo era did more than just surrender land. It fractured the Palestinian soul. The society was now divided. The authority faction, bolstered by international funds and positions of power, advocating for negotiation and coexistence. The resistance faction, led by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, viewing Oslo as a betrayal and a trap designed to bury the dream of liberation. By the late 1990s, the peace of the brave had become a hollow shell. While Arafat suppressed his own people to please his peace partners, Israel continued to expand settlements and Judaize Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority found itself trapped, acting as a shield for Israel while receiving nothing in return. The stage was set for a final, desperate confrontation. The people, weary of empty promises and the corruption of their new authority, were ready to rise again. The era of diplomacy was failing. The era of the Al-Aqsa Intifada was about to begin. Chapter 27. The Al-Aqsa Intifada, the fire that redefined the struggle. By the year 2000, the mirage of peace had completely evaporated. The gap between what the Palestinians could concede and what the Israelis would accept was unbridgeable. On September 28th, the spark was struck when Ariel Sharon, a man synonymous with the Sabra and Shatila massacres, staged a provocative entry into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The response was immediate and explosive. What began as an intifada of stones quickly transformed into a fierce, unequal war of attrition. The strategy of desperation. As the death toll climbed into the thousands, the resistance evolved. Faced with the crushing weight of the Israeli military machine, Palestinian factions, led by Hamas and the Al-Qassam brigades, unleashed their most devastating weapon, martyrdom operations. From 2000 to 2005, over 135 such missions struck deep within Israeli territory, shattering Israel's security doctrine and plunging its economy into the worst crisis in its history. The siege and the assassination of Arafat. The Intifada placed Yasser Arafat in an impossible position. He tried to use the uprising as leverage for negotiations, but the world had changed. Following the September 11th attacks, Sharon successfully framed the Palestinian struggle as part of the global war on terror. Arafat soon found himself besieged in his own headquarters in Ramallah, his authority dismantled. Under international pressure, he was forced to appoint Mahmoud Abbas as prime minister, a move intended to sideline him. In November 2004, the era of Arafat ended in a shroud of mystery, as he was reportedly assassinated via a slow-acting poison, leaving the path clear for Mahmoud Abbas to take the helm. The harvest of the Intifada. The cost of the uprising was staggering. Over 4,000 Palestinians were martyred, including 800 children. Israel lost its finest leaders to assassinations. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, and Dr. Abdulaziz al-Rantizi were killed in targeted airstrikes. Yet, the resistance did not break. It innovated, launching the first locally made rockets from Gaza. The withdrawal and the wall. Ariel Sharon, the old general, realized that Israel could no longer maintain direct control over the dense, hostile population of Gaza. He took two drastic steps that shocked his own nation. The separation wall, a massive concrete barrier designed to encircle the West Bank and block the entry of fighters. The Gaza disengagement. In 2005, Israel forcibly removed its settlers and withdrew its army from the Gaza Strip. While Sharon intended for the withdrawal to be a security move to ignite internal Palestinian strife, he failed to foresee the long-term result. Gaza, now free of internal checkpoints, would soon evolve into a formidable military stronghold, a base of resistance that would haunt Israel for decades to come. The Al-Aqsa Intifada proved that the dream of a greater Israel was dead. Even Tzipi Livni, a staunch Zionist, had to admit the era of absolute dominance was over. The Palestinian people had paid in blood, but they had forced the occupier to retreat. Chapter 28. Gaza, the liberated stronghold and the democratic shock. Gaza was always different. While the West Bank grew under the shadow of Jordanian containment, Gaza was forged in the fire of Egyptian repression and high-density struggle. Its labyrinth of alleys and tight-knit social fabric made it a nightmare for occupiers. It was the Gaza of the impossibles, a place Yitzhak Rabin once wished would simply be swallowed by the sea. But in 2005, it was Ariel Sharon who finally decided to pull out, marking the first time the Palestinian resistance forced a full Israeli retreat without a peace treaty. The post-9/11 experiment. The withdrawal from Gaza coincided with a radical shift in American policy. After the September 11th attacks, Washington concluded that Arab dictatorships were factories of resentment. The new strategy? Spreading democracy. The goal wasn't true freedom, but to absorb the energy of Islamic movements into a political process modeled after Turkey and Pakistan, where the military remains the ultimate pro-Western guardrail. Palestine was to be the laboratory for this experiment. The trap of legitimacy. Mahmoud Abbas needed more than a title. He needed the legitimacy of the ballot box to finalize the painful concessions of Oslo. The Americans and Israelis pushed for elections, certain that Fatah's 13-year grip on power and wealth would guarantee a victory. They expected Hamas to remain a manageable minority, tamed by the burdens of governance. Hamas faced a dilemma: boycott and let the cause be liquidated, or participate and risk being trapped in the Oslo web. They chose to run, not to govern, but to act as a shield of resistance within the parliament. The seismic shock of 2006. On January 25, 2006, the laboratory exploded, in a result that stunned the world and Hamas itself. The change and reform list swept the elections, winning 74 out of 132 seats. The movement, classified as terrorist by the West, had just become the legitimate democratic choice of the Palestinian people. The international community was caught in its own trap. They had demanded a free and fair election, but they could not stomach the result. The mask of democracy fell quickly. While the process was praised for its transparency, the results were met with a brutal ultimatum. Hamas must recognize Israel, renounce resistance, and accept previous agreements, or face total isolation. A stronghold in the making. Sharon's Gaza disengagement was intended to be a security move to spark internal Palestinian strife. But the election results turned Gaza into something far more dangerous for Israel, a liberated territory governed by a movement that refused to surrender its weapons. For the first time, The resistance had a geographical base, a democratic mandate, and a people willing to endure a siege rather than compromise their principles. The era of national authority was over. The era of the resistance stronghold had begun, setting the stage for a conflict that would redefine the Middle East for the next 2 decades. The military resolution, Gaza's defiant path to sovereignty. The 2006 election victory was a triumph, but it immediately triggered a war of attrition from within. Hamas found itself governing a ghost state. Ministries were emptied of funds, and the administrative machinery was sabotaged by Fatah loyalists. Most dangerously, the security forces under the command of Mohammed Dahlan and backed by millions in U.S. funding orchestrated a wave of security chaos designed to make Gaza ungovernable. The year of blood and sabotage. For over a year, Gaza bled. Interior Minister Saeed Siem was forced to create the executive force just to provide basic security, as the official police refused his orders. Behind the scenes, the Presidential Guard was being trained and armed by external advisors with one goal: to topple the elected government. Hamas leaders were targeted, and youth were thrown from buildings as the factional rift turned into a brutal civil conflict. The decisive move. By June 2007, the situation reached a breaking point. The Qassam brigades, acting on the reality that a coup against the election was underway, launched a swift military operation. In a matter of hours, the headquarters of the Preventive Security Force, the nerve center of the opposition, crumbled. The Dahlan Doctrine collapsed. And for the first time in modern history, a piece of Palestinian land was governed exclusively by its own resistance, free from the boots of Israeli soldiers or the directives of their security partners. Chapter 29, The Great Divorce, Gaza versus the West Bank. The reaction was swift and vengeful. In the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas dismissed the Haniyeh government and installed Salam Fayyad, a figure favored by Washington. This created a profound geographic and political schism. The West Bank remained under Israeli occupation and PA security coordination, where resistance networks were systematically dismantled. The Gaza Strip became a liberated stronghold, but at a devastating price. The siege of the stronghold. The world responded to Gaza's independence with a suffocating blockade. Egypt closed a Rafah crossing, and Israel cut off fuel, electricity, and medicine. Fatah even ordered public employees in Gaza to stay home or lose their salaries, attempting to paralyze the Strip's administration. Gaza was transformed into the world's largest open-air prison, a 365-square-kilometer territory where 2 million people were punished for their democratic choice. Yet, the anticipated collapse never came. Hamas adapted, creating a resistance economy and turning Gaza into a fortress. For the first time since the British Mandate, Palestinians were not merely subjects or collaborators. They were masters of their own territory, preparing for a long, grueling struggle of endurance. Gaza, the fortress of resistance in the 5 Great Wars. Since Hamas solidified its control, the Gaza Strip transitioned from a mere occupied territory into a liberated base for the Palestinian struggle. This shift created a unique administrative model where the government actively fostered resistance rather than suppressing it. To secure this stronghold, Hamas launched massive internal campaigns to dismantle Israeli espionage networks, offering amnesty to those who repented while re-employing others to feed misinformation back to Israeli intelligence. This period saw the birth of the Joint Operations Room, a unified military command that balanced the heavy burdens of governing a besieged population with the relentless demands of a growing military machine. The defiance of Gaza triggered a series of devastating conflicts. While the world often focuses on the 4 wars since 2008, the true testament to this era began in 2006 with the capture of Gilad Shalit. This operation proved that the movement would not abandon its military principles even after winning an election. Every subsequent war, in 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2021, followed a similar pattern. Israel sought to topple the resistance, but each ceasefire revealed a Hamas that was technically superior, with rockets reaching further into the heart of Tel Aviv. Yet, Despite these military achievements, the core humanitarian demand, the complete lifting of the blockade, remained a dream deferred by both Israel and a hostile Egyptian regime. The role of Egypt in Gaza's survival was both a lifeline and a chokehold. During the golden year of President Mohamed Morsi, the Rafah crossing became a true gateway for movement and weaponry. However, the 2013 military coup in Egypt brought back an era of repression even harsher than before. The Egyptian military launched a campaign to obliterate the tunnels, the enclave's sole lung, by flooding them with toxic gas and salt water, and even demolishing the Egyptian side of Rafah to create a sterile buffer zone. For the people of Gaza, this decade was an endurance test of critical power outages, closed hospitals, and a skyrocketing poverty rate in what became the world's largest open-air prison. As the blockade tightened, the resistance sought new ways to break the political deadlock. They launched the Great March of Return, redirecting public frustration away from internal governance and toward the Israeli border. Simultaneously, they worked to revive resistance in the West Bank, which had been paralyzed by the Dayton Forces, Palestinian Authority units trained by the U.S. specifically to dismantle resistance networks. While these efforts breathed a flicker of life back into the West Bank through individual acts of defiance, the strategic impasse remained. Gaza was free but suffocated, and the West Bank was occupied and suppressed. This mounting frustration culminated in the Sword of Jerusalem in 2021. For the first time, Gaza took the offensive, striking in defense of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the families facing displacement in Jerusalem. By launching rockets in response to Israeli provocations in the Holy City, Hamas sent a resounding message to the world. Gaza is no longer just a territory defending itself. It is the shield of Jerusalem. This war bridged the geographic divide and asserted that the sword of the resistance would strike whenever the red lines of the Palestinian cause were crossed. Here is the final script for the Al-Aqsa flood, Tufan al-Aqsa, closing this historical narrative with the intensity and scale of the ongoing events. I have maintained the seamless, flowing style you requested without multiple headings. Chapter 30, The Al-Aqsa Flood, a day that shook the world. For 2 years following the Sword of Jerusalem, a deceptive silence hung over the Gaza Strip. Israel mistakenly interpreted the resistance's lack of immediate military response to provocations at the Al-Aqsa Mosque as a sign of permanent deterrence. Believing Hamas had become a rational actor focused on governance rather than war, the Israeli military redeployed its elite forces to the West Bank, leaving the Gaza perimeter under the watch of a high-tech iron wall, a complex system of sensors, remote-controlled machine guns, and constant surveillance. This mirage of security vanished at dawn on Saturday, October 7, 2023. In a flawlessly coordinated assault, hundreds of resistance fighters breached the perimeter at multiple points under the cover of a massive rocket barrage. Within 6 hours, the legendary Gaza division had been overrun, its headquarters seized, and its high-ranking officers captured. The world watched in disbelief as light-armed fighters from a besieged enclave, starved of resources for 17 years, penetrated dozens of settlements, and returned to Gaza with hundreds of captives. This was a blow of unprecedented magnitude, the highest single-day death toll in Israel's history, inflicted by a group that the world's most advanced intelligence agencies had deemed effectively neutralized. The immediate objective of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood was to secure a strategic exchange to empty Israeli prisons of thousands of Palestinian detainees. However, the sheer success of the strike provoked a furious response that drew the immediate intervention of the world's superpowers. The United States moved its largest aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean, acting as a shield for Israel and a warning to any regional actors. This response laid bare a striking reality. Despite its image as an invincible regional power, Israel's stability required a direct military lifeline from the West when confronted by a small, determined resistance force. As the events of the war unfolded, they unmasked a level of brutality that shocked the global conscience. The campaign witnessed the systematic targeting of hospitals, schools, and shelters. It revealed an unfiltered bias, as Western nations provided a relentless flow of specialized ammunition and intelligence to track resistance leaders. Yet, the most painful revelation was the stance of certain regional Arab regimes. From the enforcement of Israeli-dictated restrictions at the Rafah crossing to the facilitation of alternative supply routes to circumvent naval blockades, the gap between the Arab Street and its leadership became an unbridgeable chasm. The Al-Aqsa flood stands as a monumental chapter that redefined the Palestinian cause. It exposed the paralysis of international institutions and the checked dominance of a global order that could only tally casualties without halting the violence. For the people of Gaza, the cost has been immeasurable: tens of thousands martyred and an entire territory reduced to rubble. Yet, the legacy of October 7th remains. It shattered the status quo, proved that the spirit of resistance cannot be extinguished by walls or censors, and ensured that the world can no longer ignore the fire that burns in the heart of Palestine. Insights from Palestine's modern history. The history of Palestine is a profound tapestry that mirrors the world's most significant religious, political, and legal struggles. From this rich narrative, three strategic pillars emerge as essential for understanding the conflict. 1. The primacy of the religious driver. The struggle for Jerusalem is undeniably rooted in faith. Throughout history, those who fought for this cause, Muslims, Christians, or Jews, did so in the name of their sanctity. While political leaders often use the language of international law or human rights, these secular arguments rarely inspire the same level of sacrifice as religious conviction. Religion provides an irreplaceable element: hope. This spiritual resilience is the only force capable of challenging modern security doctrines. As long as a spark of faith-based hope persists, no amount of technological superiority or military deterrence can fully extinguish the resistance. 2. The Cairo-Damascus axis. History reveals that Jerusalem's destiny is rarely decided within its walls. It reflects the vitality of the broader Muslim world. The law of unity. Jerusalem remained secure only when political unity existed between Egypt and the Levant. Historical precedents. The city fell during the Crusades and again in 1917 during periods of regional fragmentation. Liberation, therefore, is not a burden for Palestinians alone, but a collective responsibility of the entire Ummah, specifically the pivotal nations of Egypt and the Levant. 3. Engagement with global power structures. A key to the Zionist movement's success was its ability to harness existing global forces. Rather than acting in isolation, leaders like Theodor Herzl influenced international decision-makers to align Western resources with the Zionist agenda. In contrast, many modern Islamic movements have struggled by building isolated organizations that defy existing systems. History suggests that the most significant successes occur when movements adapt to prevailing societal frameworks and military institutions to further their objectives. The international context. Israel as a strategic asset. The relationship between the West and Israel is built on strategic utility. The West empowers Israel not out of submission, but as a colonial military outpost in the heart of the Middle East. Supporting Zionism is a consistent Western policy because Israel serves as a defensive wall, saving the West immense financial and human costs by maintaining regional dominance. The Palestinian cause is more than a local land dispute. It is the epicenter of a global struggle. While the challenges are immense, ranging from unparalleled Western support to regional collusion, history offers a reminder. Even the most impossible dreams can be achieved through unity, strategic engagement, and an unwavering foundation of hope. This final analytical segment shifts the focus from history and high-level geopolitics to the practical and psychological mechanics of resistance. It addresses the limitations of the modern state model and proposes a shift toward popular resistance. Below is the summary, condensed and optimized for 11 Labs narration. The architecture of resistance, from armies to an armed populace. To understand the current deadlock and the path forward, we must examine the structural and technological challenges facing the Palestinian cause. 1. The trap of the modern state model. The culture of the modern state has deeply influenced resistance strategies. Many leaders view the struggle through the lens of a specialized military, a formal, centralized force that often excludes the general public. In this model, popular participation is sometimes seen as a burden rather than a strategic resource. This centralization makes resistance movements more vulnerable to being isolated and decapitated by a superior technological power. 2. The weaponry crisis. Production versus bravery. Modern warfare has evolved beyond basic arms. Today, even simple rifles are the product of complex industrial processes. The resource gap. The nation does not lack brave fighters, but it lacks the industrial infrastructure to equip them. Historical echoes. A major factor in the 1948 Nakba was the deliberate denial of arms to Palestinians. While courage was abundant, it could not overcome the overwhelming superiority of a modern military arsenal supported by international systems. 3. Rethinking the armed people. Given the technological disparity and the fragmentation of factions, the text calls for a shift toward the concept of an armed people. This approach focuses on local innovation, utilizing engineers and technicians to transform natural resources and civilian tools into effective weapons of resistance. Mass production, designing equipment that can be manufactured locally in large quantities to ensure widespread accessibility. The deterrence challenge, finding creative ways to neutralize aerial superiority. If anti-aircraft systems cannot be imported, the resistance must innovate within its environmental constraints to mitigate the impact of bombardment. 4. The psychology of an armed community. Beyond the battlefield, the widespread arming of a population serves a deeper social and psychological purpose. Dignity and resilience. An armed populace develops a stronger sense of self-worth and a greater willingness to resist occupation. Social balance. History suggests that a well-armed community is nearly impossible to subjugate. Disarmament is almost always the first step an occupier takes to exert total control. Stability. Contrary to common fears, the text argues that an armed population can foster balanced social dynamics and discourage crime by ensuring that oppressive or criminal elements do not hold a monopoly on force. Conclusion. Turning lions into an army. The fundamental challenge is not the lack of potential, it is the organization of that potential. As the text poignantly notes, organizing a group of lions into an army is far from impossible. What is truly futile is attempting to turn sheep into soldiers. The focus must remain on empowering the existing courage of the people with the innovative tools necessary to balance the scales of history.